In this episode of Youthful Aging Secrets, we're joined by Jack Santora.
My background is exercise physiology, technically an exercise physiologist by degree. I have a minor in nutrition from the Ohio State University.
From a childhood dream of becoming a pro soccer player to finding his true calling in exercise physiology, Jack's story is one of passion and perseverance.
I thought I had a hernia. I went and saw one of the doctors next door. He kind of sent me down that mobility rabbit hole. And I really have him to thank for where I am today.
Discover how a personal health scare led Jack to a career focused on mobility and helping others achieve their fitness goals.
I was starting to experience all these things. My knees were sore, hurting. It would hurt to get shoes out of the bottom of the closet, which, when you're in your mid-20s, you probably shouldn't be saying, right?
Jack emphasizes the transformative power of mobility, not just for athletes, but for everyone looking to stay active and pain-free.
Your foot sets up a good foundation. You're on your feet a lot. So I like to give attention to the feet as much as we can. Barefoot time is a good thing. Start with your feet. Stick your fingers between your toes for 2 minutes and then try and crush your fingers with your toes.
From simple daily habits to advanced techniques, Jack shares practical tips you can start today to improve your mobility and overall health. Don't miss this episode of Youthful Aging Secrets with Jack Santora.
Jack, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time. And we can just get started right away. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, why don't we start at the beginning? Your background, what you do, exactly how you got there, that kind of stuff.
Well, I can make that a real long story, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, so my background is exercise physiology, technically an exercise physiologist by degree. I have a minor in nutrition from the Ohio State University, so up from Ohio originally. But I think the way I got into everything that I'm doing is kind of just an interesting story in general. When I was younger, I've always been athletic, played a lot of sports, specifically soccer was my big one. So I played 20 plus years of soccer. I mean, I played basketball in my younger years, played baseball, did all those things, just was always active as a kid. And my dad was a bodybuilder. My mom was always active. So that shouldn't come as a surprise that it was kind of natural that it came to me in that way as well. But as a kid, I started lifting weights probably in middle school, and it was mainly because of soccer. So my whole thing when I was younger was like, I'm gonna go pro. I'm gonna go pro soccer. That's my goal. So as most young kids would be, but I was small. I'm only 5'6". I'm not a big guy to begin with, and back then I maybe weighed a buck 25. So there wasn't much on me, and my goal was to just put muscle on for soccer so I could at least hold my own on the field and really make up for it in that way. So my lifting and weight training career kind of started then in middle school. And as I was getting into it more, there were pictures of my dad in his bodybuilding days, which, I mean, he didn't do that professionally or anything. He just did it when he was younger as well. And he had pictures of him in his Speedo, doing some poses. So those were always inspiration for me, sitting right there over my shoulder. They got me this cable machine when I was in middle school because they knew I was getting into it, and they supported that kind of stuff. So we got a machine. We had all his old free weights down there. But as I was getting into it more, it was just if I could get paid to do this would be awesome, right? So ultimately, if there was some way I could get paid to work out, that would be cool. But my first plan was always go pro, play soccer. So when I finally got to okay, now I'm about to go to college, I did not make, I wasn't picked up for OSU or anything like that. My goal was to walk on at a D1 school and, try that. So I played club at OSU and did try to walk on, didn't make it. So my plan B was okay, well, what happens now when I'm going to have a harder time trying to go pro or anything like that? I love the game. I just wanted to be around it. So I was all right, well, I'll try and find some degree, because when I went to Ohio State, initially I was in their exploration, which means you just don't know what you're doing, right? You're still trying to figure that out. So one of the guys I was rooming with finally mentioned exercise phys, and I was like, oh, tell me more about that. I'd never heard of it before. Then, it's just kind of a new thing to me. So after he told me that, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. I'll maybe get in with the sports team as a strength and conditioning specialist after that and do that whole, aspect of it. That didn't happen either. Okay, I did the schooling, got the degree, and then was looking for a job right after, and I got it as an aquatics instructor at the place I did my last internship at, which was a cardiac rehab center, pulmonary rehab center, and pretty much anything the farthest you could expect from like working with athletes directly, like I was initially thinking. So it was a complete switch, but it was like it was a job, and I was like, all right, I'm getting paid to do what I went for school for right out of college. Not the worst thing in the world, right? Ended up meeting some people through that job that were they owned a sports performance center. Got a job there as well, and it was mainly soccer specific. So I did a lot of soccer coaching and training of younger athletes in that sense. And I always joke because between those two jobs for the first decade of my career, I literally worked with people who were ages 4 to 90. And just, I would have, like, looking back with 2020 hindsight, I would have never guessed, like, how impactful and experiential, like, that experience could be for me to just gain that knowledge of how to work with the athletic population, but also how to handle aging athletes in that way. And that's kind of how I like to look at it, is just like, the people that are trying to stay physically active as they age, and I gained a lot of experience from that. So I did that for like 10 years, and then actually got promoted to the lead exercise physiologist at the cardiac rehab center I was at there. And 6 months later, my wife and I and her parents all decided we were going to move to North Carolina, actually, after I had accepted that promotion. And that's when I took on the opportunity to start my own business at that point, which had always kind of been in the back of my head. But that's kind of where that's the long story of it, as quick as I could tell it. But it gives you an idea of kind of like where I've come from with it, I guess, hopefully.
Absolutely, I love it. So actually, that brought up a few questions. I think it's really interesting that you had such a gap, a nice long gap of dealing with the younger all the way through to the older. And just a question was, were they all athletic or former athletes? My understanding was they were most of them were former athletes, or
Not
no?
well, no, not necessarily, not all, no. So in the facility, it was so there was cardiac rehab, there was pulmonary rehab, there was a general fitness center. So I actually did a lot of personal training at the facility, just working with general population there. And there was, I mean, they had like Parkinson's programs, they had physical therapy next door. They had the doctors there were actually the doctors for the Columbus Blue Jackets hockey team. So I was, directly interacting with those physical therapists, the doctors, and just working alongside of them, and as well as I think it was like 16 or so other exercise physiologists that were around. And then again, in an aquatics department, but also training up on land. It was kind of like I was all over the place there with that, but there was a lot going on there. And then the soccer center that had, they did like speed and agility work. They did, so those were, I think it was like up to college age athletes there. So it kind of like 4-year-old up to college age athletes. And then the average age was probably like 50s or 60s at the other center as well.
That's really cool. And like you said, in hindsight, you look back, it's probably been invaluable to have that experience because you get to see all these different walks of life, goals, their different goals and stuff. And so, with that experience, what would you say was the difference when dealing with, let's say, somebody who's athletic and young and then transitioning to they're leaving their career, for example, or they're no longer an athlete or professional athlete and now they're beat up. I think most athletes are a little beat up, if you especially at the pro level, right? At least maybe now things are changing. People are, I think, are more conscious of the importance of mobility, rehab, and recovery. But I think throughout the 80s and 90s and even the 2000s, people are kind of like just go hard and go home.
It's an interesting question because I would say, honestly, I almost wish I had the knowledge that I do now back then when I was actually working in that setting, because I probably would have done things a lot differently. And when I started focusing on mobility more, it was actually toward the end of my career at those places. Um, I'd honestly, it was stuff that I was dealing with in my own body that it was like, okay, wait, I'm a personal trainer. I'm supposed to be really fit. I mean, technically, I had a lot of muscle mass at the time. I was cardiovascularly like, it was I was pushing myself to the limit with everything. So it was really working myself hard in that way. But I hadn't been doing any of the mobility stuff, so I was starting to experience all these things. And I just remember like my knees were sore, hurting. It would like hurt to get shoes out of the bottom of closet, which, when you're in your mid 20s, you probably shouldn't be saying, right? it it was, lower back issues. My hip would literally click in and out of position depending on how heavy I squatted and what was going on there. So there were issues that were going on. I thought I had a hernia, and this was probably like one of the key pivotal moments where it like switched my mindset, because I was dealing with this pain, and I was like, oh, did I suffer a hernia? Do I have to get surgery to have this repaired? So I went and saw one of the doctors next door, because it was one that I actually trusted. He was doing CrossFit. He was very minimally invasive individual in the first place. And I was like, checked me out, actually looked at some different mobility pieces in my body. And he's like, here, just try these things. And he kind of sent me down that mobility rabbit hole. And I really have him to thank for like the career change that I took to where I am today, and the focus and just the way that I approach everything up to this point. So a lot of the people that I was dealing with in that center, I mean, for the longest time, I got really good at working around issues. And I think people do this a lot. They get really good at, okay, I have a problem. What are the alternatives that to work around it, right? So we're not really addressing the issue per se, but we could still manage. We should still get by, right? So I think that was something like that really stood out to me, is like there was a lot of working around issues that were, you name it. I probably had dealt with it or seen it, where it's just shoulders, low back, knees, all those common ones. And it was mostly a workaround. But then when I started to actually see the changes that I was experiencing in my body through the mobility work that I was implementing, and it was very sloppy in the beginning, I'll tell you now, there was not a real systematic approach to it. It was kind of like, I'll do some self myofascial release here, I'll use this as I need to. And it was very, still discovery experimental based in my own body. But I would implement those things even into the members that I was working at that time, and started to just notice how powerful it really could be, and the changes it could make in people who thought like, the typical thing you hear is like, oh, well, I'm getting older. This is probably just natural. This should hurt, right? Like kind of that mindset. So I think that's one thing that stands out to me out of all of that. And hopefully that kind of answered your question as well as with what you were going for there.
It did, and we talked about this off of camera and whatnot. That for me, I started to have a really deep interest in mobility and just movement in general, because my father, he had Parkinson's, right? So he had a movement disorder, and so that was where I started to learn about that kind of thing. But then also for myself, I've always been athletic. My initial thing was like MMA, and I still train, but I was one of those like, oh, like I looked at mobility as an afterthought. I never thought it was stupid or anything like that, but it was just kind of like, I'll do these things when I'm injured, or something had to be wrong in order for me to address it. And even then, it was only because it was stopping me from training, or like, but now I've taken like a 360, and I'm kind of learning like, oh shit, I wish I took it just as serious as the training, because I think it could have extended what I wanted to do and whatnot, right? So yeah, long story short is, now I look at it like, I think mobility is just as important as actually exercise and training. I think it's part of it, not something that needs to be done when you're injured. Would you agree with that? I think I know the answer, but and
Right.
why?
Well, first of all, I was that person too. I mean, so it was just that mindset of like, again, kind of going back to my soccer experience, I was like, I hated anytime our coaches made us warm up before the game, because I felt, but here's the problem. It was mostly like static stretching at that time. So we now know that static stretching is going to down your performance if you're doing an extended period. I could literally feel that as a younger player. I was like, okay, I've lost explosiveness in this because of this warm up. So my mindset, like before I had that switch again, was like, no, I don't need to stretch. I don't need to mess around with this stuff. It's let's go do the strength training. Let's go do the conditioning. Let's go play. We're good. But as I've, obviously had my own personal experiences and dealt with the aches and pains, it is incredible. I'll say this, and hopefully for anybody who's listening that like maybe is in that reactive mindset still, I mean, it is incredible the difference in my body in how quickly. Okay, I'm not saying I am ever like I'm still human, right? So there's still risk for injury. There's still, potential that I get hurt. That still happens. But when it does happen, it is incredible the rate that my body actually recovers at now compared to what I would actually expect happening in someone who wasn't well prepared or had their body well adapted in the first place. Stuff that people just don't believe. I literally, okay, true story, tore my meniscus 3 weeks ago now. Okay, when my son was on my knee, I was down in a deep squat. He was throwing a tantrum. He was wiggling around. He shifted my knee in a really weird way. I felt it actually pop out. We could see it out of the medial part of my knee there. I slowly straightened the leg back out. It clicked back into place, and I was like, okay, this is actually. Part of me, like inside, was like, I'm kind of scared here. Okay, like I'm a little worried. 3 weeks later, I have almost 100% of my mobility back, minus maybe some of those really more extreme areas that I might normally be able to go into. It still wants to catch, like if I sit in a really deep position, I could tell it's still something there, but very minimal soreness based on the position. Again, full range of motion. And normally, like in my mind, again, I was kind of even concerned when it initially happened and how my body was responding just that first day or so and that first couple days. I can kind of tell if it's like how serious of a thing it is. And I was like, okay, this might be something. I don't know how this is going to go, but we're going to do the stuff that I know how to do. And 3 weeks later, it's almost all the way back where very minimal catching, very minimal soreness, and almost 100% range of motion. So, you know, that is one of the things time and time again that I've seen is like the injuries may come, but the body is so much more prepared to just bounce back from that if you've done the right things prior and just set yourself up for success in that way. I think people settle for such a almost like a low standard of like quality that hey, if I can sit, if I can walk, if I can stand, those are kind of their measures. But like really, we can do better than that. And that's why they're when the injury does happen, they don't have that the limited range of motion they had just went to even less, and it's just kind of that it's a slippery slope that people play a game with there, of thinking that well I'll just wait for something to happen and I'll address it then, and it's that reactive mindset when really the mobility stuff, if you're doing it the right way, it is it is everything. It's all encompassing, and that's how I envision it. I mean, that is how I see it. So, the strength training is a piece of the mobility training. The
Mhm.
cardiovascular conditioning, I mean, that can be a part of what your overall mobility encompasses. Flexibility, that is a piece of what mobility encompasses. But when you ask somebody, "Hey, what's mobility?" A lot of people are going to say, "Well, it's the the way I'm able to stretch or my flexibility." Those types of words come up. They might mention range of motion if they're really good. They'll talk about like controlling movement if that, but you can ask 10 different people and a lot of them are just going to have a very simplified answer of it
Mhm.
where that you can tell they just there's not that hasn't been opened into their mind quite yet and they're not able
Right.
to fully pull that definition together, honestly.
What is the difference between mobility and flexibility, and where do they intersect?
Sure. So let me give you an idea of how I actually coach my members that are working with me. So to simplify the process, because I just want to make it as consumable and understandable as possible, I basically explain it as three pillars that we're going to be focusing on. Okay. So we have our range of motion. Okay. And when I think of range of motion, we're talking about the capacity of a joint, passive and active. Okay. So we want to know, do we have a good passive range of motion? Do we have a good active range of motion? And then our goal is to close the gap between those two. So we really want to maximize that passive range, and then we want to maximize the active range to close that gap. They'll never be the same, but they are kind of two pieces of that we can consider together. I also think of, when I think of range of motion, of the joint articulation itself. So is the joint moving well on itself? Is it really moving in the design that it should have? Is something inhibiting that? Is there pain with that joint movement? Is the capsule all right? And then, like, the position of the joint. Okay, so is the head of my shoulder in a good position in that glenohumeral joint there? Or if it's my hip, is the acetabulum in a good position there? The head of the femur in that a good position? Because that can change what's happening at the soft tissues around it. Okay, so we got the range of motion. All right, the flexibility, and when I think about flexibility, this is kind of not just, a lot of people think of just stretching or their ability to lengthen a muscle. When I think about flexibility, I'm actually thinking about almost the balance of those tissues. So agonist and antagonist muscle groups, are they equal? Because a lot of times, again, with what's happening in our society, people have changes in their structural, postural position that's keeping one at length the whole time, and they're trying to stretch that muscle, but it's already at stretch, so they're having issues there because they're always going to be chronically tight in that sense. And the other side, is basically shortened up, so they find themselves in this limbo where one side's fully lengthened, the other side feels tight too because it's completely shortened. They can't figure out which one to actually stretch or address. But it's that balance of those tissues. It's the overall ability of those tissues to glide over one another in the way that they should inside of our body. Okay. And and yeah, and then from there we can increase the capacity of those tissues to some degree, as long as they're balanced and your control over that range to some degree. And then the last piece is the stability and strength. So when we put those three together, if you kind of look at the systems, you got the skeletal system, you got your soft tissue fascial system, and then you got your neuromuscular connection and control, your motor patterning. Okay, and those are all three pieces. Like, we can't separate them out, honestly, but we can, if we're focusing on those three all together, we can really influence a lot and make some big changes there. So that's kind of how I try and simplify it for the people that I'm working with. Is, when I design these sessions, we're addressing joints, the position of them, the way they articulate. We're addressing the quality of the soft tissues. We're trying to rehydrate the tissues. We're trying to strengthen them through blood flow restriction in some cases. We're using things like systemic enzymes to help break down scar tissue if they've had a history of injury or anything like that. So we're taking an internal approach in that way and influencing it in that. And then we're making sure that we save all that range of motion and flexibility that we have now developed by training it through stability and strength through as much of that range of motion as we possibly can. So does that give you a better idea kind of on that?
Yeah, I love it because it's not just you're encompassing an entire system, because everything communicates together. And I totally agree with that. I love how you broke it down into three categories, if I understood correctly.
Yep.
Would you classify it all under mobility, or is it mobility just one component of it?
So I view that as basically, like, I'll even call that an equation. So I'll say mobility equals range of motion plus flexibility plus stability. So it literally is just like a math equation. If we can get those three pieces intertwining, it's going to be the overall end result of what makes up your mobility in that.
That's really cool. So, okay, let's take the average listener would be somebody in their 30s, 40s, even going to 50s. And most people who are going to listen to something like this are already kind of conscious of their health, or they really want to make changes. I think flexibility, mobility is something that most people, unless they have like an athletic background and a coach who was like adamant about it, like gymnastics or something, I think they neglect like range of motion, and I think they just kind of go for whatever the attribute that their sport calls for, whatever they were doing, right? So if
Mhm.
it's bodybuilding, it might just be hypertrophy. If it's if it's like a sprinter, they want speed and like explosiveness, and like a MMA person, they might just want to be able to have isometric strength and cardiovascular endurance and all these things, right? So for somebody who doesn't have a coach or when and they're just getting started, where do you think is a good starting point, if
Yeah,
that makes
sure.
sense?
So I mentioned my three pillars, but there's also kind of like some initial places that we'll always want to check because they have a significant impact on basically the systems overall. So when I look at the body, again, it's kind of looking at, well, we got kind of the system of the arm, the system of the legs, and then basically how does that interact with the core structure and that system, and it all comes together to be one in the end. But again, to kind of simplify it, if you were to just start on your mobility today, one of the most important things you're going to want to look at is what is your core organization and stability. So when we talk about your core, I mean, this is just like the core of an apple, your spinal column from neck to tailbone. If you have any structural or postural issues there, those can be indicative of instabilities, whether it be coming from your core or whether it be coming from the extremity. Okay. But just as kind of like a coverall, it's good. You hear a lot about core work, right? It's good to hear a lot about core work, but I think people still get the wrong idea of like what that actually entails. So when I talk about core organization and stability, I have something I call a five-dimensional core. So we have basically five dimensions that we really want to make sure we're good at when it comes to core training. And this is important because if I don't have the ability to organize and stabilize my core well, then I'm going to suffer because my central nervous system is going to automatically shut down mobility to the extremities from that point. Okay. Or I'm at a higher risk because now my core, which is not fully stabilized, is going to take force that it shouldn't necessarily be taking in the way that it normally does. And that's why we see a lot of back pains or, injuries like that really stand out as big ones. So when I talk about five-dimensional core, there's kind of this approach where initially I want people to be able to do what I call the antis. Okay. So if we think of the other movements that our spine is actually designed for, because it is designed, we have to acknowledge that it's designed for these other movements, but we first of all have to be able to stabilize it before we worry about those other movements in the first place. So we got your flexion, we got your extension, we got your rotation, and we got your lateral flexion. Okay. So those are the other movements. So the antis are literally anti-flexion, anti-extension, okay, anti-rotation, and anti-lateral flexion. So I need to first of all, be able to resist outside forces that are trying to pull me into one of those positions that could compromise my spinal column when I'm carrying a load or executing an exercise or something like that. That has to be a part of my control. It might not always be athletically advantageous, though. Okay. So it is important that I do know how to organize in two other positions at least, which are going to be like global flexion and global extension. Okay. Now, the keyword global in there is also very important because global means we're using that full length. Okay. It's almost like that load is being distributed amongst from head to tailbone again. Okay. When we think about that force versus the way when people segment a spinal column, okay, or a load causes there to be a segmentation in the spine, that point where there's that extra pressure in the spine, well, that tells me we've got a broken link in that system of global flexion or maintaining neutral or global extension. Okay, so anywhere that force comes along the spinal column, if there's one point, you're likely not stabilizing well in that position. Okay, so from there, once you kind of master those antis, okay, and you can stabilize in good positions, and that might be like something as simple as a plank, or if you just hold a weight off to one side, then you're going to be challenging that anti-lateral flexion where your body's going to want to bend to one side, or if you're holding a band that wants to pull you into rotation and just resisting that. Those are some examples of kind of like exercises you could use to really develop that. Once you master that, then we do want to start to play with, okay, can I control flexion with some load? Can I control extension with some load and resistance? Can I rotate and control the rotation and manage that movement well, and lateral rotation as well? So, once you have that base, you can expand from there. But that's going to be a thing that really dictates a lot of how much mobility you can open up based off of how safe your spinal column and central nervous system actually feel. Okay, so that was a long-winded way of saying that's very important. Right? The other pieces that are important to that, though, also, and again, I mentioned the system of the arm, system of the leg, is, well, the way the legs and arms work is very similar. So it's a torsion based system. So again, it kind of comes down to that rotational piece of being able, like, if you think of a banded cord being wrapped together, three cords wrapped together, makes it stronger than, when you have those twisted over. So our arms and our legs actually kind of work like that. So if you look at their design, they're built for torsion. And when we look at torsion, that's rotation from your shoulder and a second force from the base, which is either going to be your hands or your feet. That could be friction, or it could be like irradiation if I'm gripping something and I've got like a bar to break in my hands there. So my ability to actually generate torque at the shoulder and rotate the shoulder and the hip can influence how my core responds as well. So a simple example might be if someone has poor core control and they go to reach overhead, but they also have poor shoulder mobility and limited rotation, well, they're either not going to be able to reach overhead, or they're going to compensate at the spinal column to get the reach overhead. Okay, do you see how they interact with one another in that way? That's how our body works.
Makes
Something's got to
sense.
give,
Yeah.
and they have to find a way to work together. It doesn't always mean it's optimal, but it'll get the job done at least, right?
Right. Right.
And that's where people end up getting hurt, though, is because a lot of times we're working in get her done mode versus what's actually optimal for our movement, which is why kind of goes back to your question of why should somebody be focusing on all this in the first place, is because
Right.
you could be moving and getting it done, but that doesn't mean that it's actually what's best for your body and the longevity of it in that sense.
Right. Right. And the way I look at it now, because my daughter's also very athletic. She's 15, and she's got really tight like hamstrings and just things like that. And I tell her like we have to address this now, and we got to work on this now, because it's for you at this age. It's going to be much easier than post injury, God forbid, or in your 40s and 50s. Because right now she bounces back so quickly from even like, soreness or whatever.
Mhm.
Because we'll work out together, and I'm like, even to me, I'm like, I'm done, man. And she's like, I can keep going. Like, girls typically recover quicker too. I don't know if that's backed by science, but that's my observation and from what I've heard, and I can attest. Like, I feel like women recover way faster. But so to what you said, as an example, I had talked to you about this. So I had a hip injury through wrestling that I didn't address. I kind of just pushed through it. I just waited till it wasn't hurting as much and kept going. And over time, my knee and my hamstrings, everything was overcompensating for the lack of mobility in my hip on the right side. And so eventually I injured my LCL, which led to other things just from simply neglecting what was originally an issue, and probably not that big of an issue, right?
Yep. Yep.
And so it just goes back to what you're saying. It's like in my ego driven way to like speed up, it ended up probably costing me way more time. And even now I'm still dealing with it. Like I'm still working through it. So, okay. So I have a question
Yep.
that people are doing now that maybe you didn't notice before. And one thing as an example, have you noticed an impact with cell phone usage because of looking down? Have you seen something like from your observation, like, holy shit, people's spines are changing or their postures just from simply texting? Because that is definitely a new behavior globally. Like people are, I would say, hours looking down. That's got to be affecting our posture, our spine. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the biggest ones. I think some of the biggest postural changes, and I think this is funny because I talk to people constantly in my DMs, and I'm reaching out to people like trying to offer some guidance, some advice, some help if
Yes.
they really want that type of help. And one of the questions I'll just commonly ask is like, and I don't think people get it. I think they think it's like odd that I asked this question, because a lot of times people just go blank and not respond after I ask the question. So it's like, all right, something they don't understand how this could possibly connect to what they're actually experiencing with pain wise. But like, just to kind of break it up, so if somebody's experiencing like a shoulder pain or like a neck issue, something like that, I will ask, like, hey, do you have head forward posture, shoulder forward rounding? Do your elbows flare outward? Do you have uneven shoulder heights? I mean, these are things that I'm asking about because your body's telling me something if it's holding one of those positions
Mm,
about how your body is stabilizing. Okay.
right.
And that can be a large factor. If it's not the full root, it's at least putting more pressure on those joints than it needs to be. Okay, so it might not be the full root issue at hand, but it's not making that shoulder's job any easier. Or with the lower body things, I'll ask about like anterior pelvic tilt, lateral pelvic tilt. Do you have knee cave where the knees are falling in toward one another, or ankle cave, or your ankles collapsing in toward one another? Are your feet flat? Do your feet turn out? Do you have bunions? Do you have hammer toes? What's going on with your toes? They see these things and they're talking to me about back pain, and it's just like, you can tell it just goes right over their head, man. And I'm asking these things with a specific purpose, and this is where like my mind has to come down to their mindset and kind of make that connection. But those are the common things that I just mentioned there for both the upper and lower body that I commonly recognize when people do say, oh yeah, well, I do have this. And it's funny because some will say, well, yeah, I've got this, but I don't think it connects. It's like, I mean, do, who I came here to offer some help. Let me just give you some advice here.
Yeah.
And it does. It affects you. It's probably impacting you in more of a way than you really think. But that's just an example. And to kind of like a story in my own body, I broke my left wrist when I was in middle school. Okay. And obviously in middle school, you don't do anything about that other than put it in a cast. And then eventually, I still lifted weights. So it was fine for the longest time. But eventually, I also injured my left shoulder at one point. And I never got it fully diagnosed, but I'm pretty sure it was some form of labral tear to that left shoulder because I was doing pull ups and working on trying to do single arm pull ups and came down really fast and jerked the arm. And it was something that lasted me a long time. That was another one of those, well, I don't know if this is going away, but I'm going to work at it type thing. And this is before I made my full mobility switch, because once I did, I recognized, whoa, my wrist lacks rotation. And now I'm not able to generate the torque that I should be able to at the shoulder, which made it less stable, which fed into the injury. So
Right.
these are things that, like, in my head, I start to see that make a connection that maybe others might not in that sense.
Let's say somebody's just starting out, they're somewhat active, but they're really looking to address structural issues or things that they haven't been doing, or they're just being a little bit more conscious, because the whole longevity thing is very popular now, and so is mobility. Everybody's talking about movement, which is great, but I think there's a lot of conflicting information, and I think there's a lot of information overload. And so just right out the gate, when somebody wakes up, what would you think are some good things in the morning, in the afternoon, in the night before bed?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, you got to start with, you got to meet yourself where you're at in anything. So it's very important. And this is something that I'll always try and do with people that I'm working with, is we've got to meet you where you're at to a certain degree as well. If you've never done this before, if it's not accessible, you're going to have a problem. So one thing that you could even just start with is, you know, I'm big on, really, your foot sets up a good foundation. You're on your feet a lot. So I like to give attention to the feet as much as we can. Barefoot time is a good thing. So if you can just be barefoot longer throughout your day. I'm actually barefoot right now. You can't see it, but I'm barefoot right now. The majority of my day I spend barefoot, but spend some time barefoot and don't put shoes on when you go outside necessarily. Uh, I mean, I'm not anywhere that's freezing cold right now, but it's cold. My toes can tell it's cold right now. I walk across the rocks to my basement to go to work every day, right? So to feel those different textures of grass, dirt, rocks, that alone is going to start to impact how your feet feel. A lot of people, again, kind of fall into the trap of, well, my feet need some form of support. I've lost my arch, or they're weak because You
Me.
haven't done anything. You haven't done anything about them. So start with your feet. Stick your fingers between your toes for 2 minutes, and then try and crush your fingers with your toes. Flex, release, and just keep working deeper and deeper in
So
between there.
like
Yep.
if this is my
If
toes,
this is your
I'd stick
toes,
my
interlace
fingers, and
those fingers.
I'm trying to squeeze my fingers with my toes.
Yep, absolutely. So you're kind of even building that intrinsic foot strength just by
Okay.
doing that. You can do that while you're watching TV. Honestly, one of the things that the other thing is, instead of crunching them, splay them as far as you can. Spread those toes as wide as you can. A lot of times, again, overlooked area. You, you start playing with foot control, and if you have a hard time spreading your toes, if you have a hard time lifting your big toe or lifting your small toes individually from one another, that's a good place to start to work, actually.
Hmm.
Okay, that can build some strength that you're lacking, which is probably affecting the arch of your foot, or at the very minimal, affecting how you walk, you stand, you squat, all that stuff. It's probably
That's
one of the
huge.
biggest changes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I cannot move my toes individually. It stops at the ring toe and the pinky toe, whatever.
yeah, yeah.
They go together, and
Yeah,
my girlfriend's always making fun of me because she's like, she could do it, right? She can like,
yeah,
and
yep,
I'm like, fuck. I'm like, I can't do it. She's like, she thinks I'm joking. I'm like, no, I literally can't move the, like they can move together. And I'm flat footed. I've been flat footed since I can remember, but it's
yeah.
gotten worse. It's
Well,
definitely not inactivity. I don't know what it is. If it's genetic.
you see, and I think a lot of this comes back to, like, just, our parents didn't know they were doing anything bad, but they were putting us in shoes for the longest time. I played soccer. My right, my right smallest toe, I didn't have control over for 5 years. That's
Wow.
about how long it took me to finally gain control where I can now splay it again. It took
Interesting.
me, I never expected it to come back necessarily, but I was doing these things that I just mentioned, and that's what brought it back right there. So it it's one of those things, you got to kind of trust the process,
Yeah.
and literally one day I just saw a flicker, and I was like, all right, we have hope. And from there it built. It was just like something finally clicked. Like, I finally remade that neurological connection in my body
That's cool.
where I was
That's cool.
able to control it. And it's one of the biggest things I'll work on with people anymore if they have any lower body issues. So one of the
Interesting.
simplest things, just work your feet. And I actually, so you said start with like morning. That's actually probably something I would do at the end of the day, because a lot of us are wearing shoes, right? So just finish your day with something like that where you're working your feet for a little while.
So fingers in between your toes, squeeze your fingers, and how long, how many reps, how many sets? Somebody
We
get
call that
just
a
started.
contract relax method. Okay.
Okay.
So what we're doing is actually kind of down regulating those muscles that are holding a little bit too much tension, and it will immediately give you a little bit more range of motion, you'll notice. And you can use that with other tissues and areas in your body as well. But basically, if you have a hard time and you're initially sticking your fingers between your toes and you're only able to get like this far, give that flex, relax, 5 second
Mhm.
flex, nice and hard. By the way, your feet are probably going to want to cramp on you because they're weak. Don't
Yes.
stray away from the cramp. Flex harder into the cramp. It will go away sooner than if you just keep jumping ship every time you cramp.
Oh, cool. Good tip.
Yeah, real
Cool.
deal.
I
Okay,
like that.
so
I like that.
so keep flexing, then work your way in. 2 minutes is a good time window for a lot of mobility work that I recommend in areas. So, like, if I'm doing self myofascial release, that's where we start to see some changes in the fascia. It's really allowing your body to move a little bit better. Are you going to see like long lasting changes in that one session over that 2 minutes? Nah, you got to keep up with the reps to make that lasting change. But it's a good place to start. So 2 minutes per time, kind of minimum there is a good rough estimate. And you can trust your body too. If you start fatiguing and you do need a break, take a break. Listen to yourself in that
Right.
sense. Boy.
Barefoot time. Right now it's winter. I'm in Toronto. It's like minus, we use Celsius. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. It's like minus 20
I was gonna say, yeah.
Celsius. It's cold, dude. Barefoot ain't happening right now. But I do use that philosophy. I'm also barefoot. And I'm
Well,
also standing. I'm not sitting, like that
yeah.
kind of.
Well, and I don't expect anybody to be outdoors in negative temperatures. I mean, I wouldn't do that. It's like I'm in North Carolina. I was originally from Ohio, so I understand negative temperatures at
Yeah.
times, right? But I've gotten weaker as I've moved further south,
Yeah.
apparently. And it's like 40 degrees, and my toes are like, well, we're testing the limits a little bit here. I can tell.
That's funny.
But in that case, I do recommend switching to a minimalist shoe. Okay, but a lot of people make the switch to a minimalist shoe and don't do any of the intrinsic foot strengthening with it, and then they'll have issues with the minimalist shoe,
Mhm.
or their foot's not ready for it actually yet. So if you incorporate those foot exercises when you can be barefoot at home, spend as much time as you can, and just kind of build that time up gradually, and then get minimalist footwear. The craziest thing, like I'll work with people and I'll have them doing like these daily foot exercises. And within 4 weeks, they're asking about, hey, I need to switch out my footwear because the old shoes I have, they're really uncomfortable. The shoes that used to be comfortable and could only be comfortable, right? You
Mm.
need lots of cushion. You need
Right, right.
it's 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 amazing, and their foot just doesn't fit in that shoe anymore.
Do you have any shoes you recommend?
Yeah, yeah. So the most common brands are, or most popular that are easy access pretty much wherever you're at, are going to be Zero, Xero. I keep doing thumbs up and that thing keeps popping
Yeah,
up.
it's weird.
So Zero and then Vivo Barefoot. Those are probably like your two main brands, but there's definitely more options coming out. The hardest thing to find is probably like a dress shoe that's minimalist right now. But if you're doing like athletic or just even casual, you can find some good options by those two brands there. And then there's some other brands popping up that are becoming a little bit bigger as well, because it's again more of a conscious thing now where actually people are paying attention to it. If you're in summer and you're looking for sandals, there's a brand called Earth Runners. That's a really good brand. I like their sandals quite a bit. So those are some options. But if you need boots, Vivo and Zero both have boots. If it's
Okay.
wintertime and you need something, Zero has more of a rugged, like hiking type feel to it. Vivo's more, maybe a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? More modern look to it. And not that Zero's not modern, but I guess it's more of like a kind of got more of that aesthetic appearance to them. I guess a lot of the Vivo shoes in that way.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Okay. That's cool. Any other foot exercises for somebody just getting started? Did I miss something?
So individual extension. So lift
Oh,
the big
yes.
toe, keep the small toes down, and then keep the big toe down, lift the small toes. I would start with those, honestly, just not to
Awesome.
overcomplicate it. Other easy stuff that you can sprinkle in your day as you're going about your day. First of all, minimize your chair sitting, honestly. Stand at an island and work standing in that sense. Okay. Standing alone is not a solution. Like people think like, the whole standing desk thing was like, oh yeah, I'll be better because
Yeah.
I got a standing desk, or I'm walking treadmill desk, something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Again, that's not necessarily the fix, because if you have like structural postural issues that are underlying, and you're kind of just weak in general, you're still going to have issues in your low back when you stand for a long time, or it's if your feet are weak, that's going to bother your feet after a while for a long time. So
Yeah.
if you have the opportunity to switch up your working position or your sitting position regularly, I recommend doing that as much as you can. So work standing, work from a squatting position, work from like a 90-90 sit position, work from even just like a Z sit position where your legs are out in front of you, or like a straddle type sit position.
Okay. Yeah.
Work from a hurdler's like stretch type position. So, or like if you have kids, play with them in those positions. The cool thing about that is because you'll be playing with them in the 90-90 position. They'll want you to reach for something. Guess what? You're going to reach for it and you're not going to get out of that position. And you're going to automatically be working those joints and putting pressures on them in a way that is kind of a little bit sporadic for your body. It might be new to it. You'll notice it, you'll feel it, but it's okay. So if you can kind of play and work in different positions, that can be another way to just pepper your day with mobility stuff that doesn't have to be strict, like where you're in the gym and
Right.
addressing it that way. And can be an easy place to start.
With respect to standing versus sitting, it's not to say, oh, all my issues went away, but I did notice an immediate effect within literally a couple of days by swapping out to a standing desk. And I can still sit if I want,
Right.
but also just doing things like what you're saying, like I will bend my toes on one foot and kind of just put weight on it.
Yeah.
I'll do the opposite. I'll switch stances. I might go into like a hamstring stretch while I'm standing.
Mhm.
And sometimes I'll just do like, like move my hips like in circular, and those things have made it a noticeable impact for me.
Yeah.
So while it's like you said, it's definitely not a fix all, it did make a huge difference, like
Yeah.
noticeable.
Well, and we're made to move. We're not meant to
Right.
be very static for long. And what we're doing is kind of isolating ourselves to these positions. And realistically, sitting is one of the positions that puts the most compression on like your lower back and spine in
Yes.
that way. So, again, we sit in those positions for a long time. The muscles adapt to those positions. We get very stiff because of that. It's kind of like this. We're setting our own death trap here in a way by just forcing ourselves to do that. So the more you can just play with positions, even like if you had like a stool where you could put your foot up on one and do kind of like a Captain Morgan pose. I
Yeah.
mean, switch it up and just be creative about how you're switching it up and play with it in that way. It doesn't, I don't care if anybody thinks you're weird. You shouldn't care either, right? So just if you're at your cubicle putting your foot up on your desk and working, it's all good, right? It's your
Yeah.
desk.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I've worked in office settings as well. I've seen a lot more people, more usually girls are more open to it, but they'll have like the Swiss ball,
yep,
the bouncy ball, and they'll use that as opposed to a chair.
sure.
And then they'll switch from that to standing, and they'll all be like, listen, it's made a huge difference for me. Like
Mhm.
even some of them have said like, oh, I get a less intensity with my period cramps and stuff, and I'm like, that's, I don't know why, but
Yeah,
they've noticed like my the cramping is lesser like than it
yeah.
was before. Could
Interesting.
just be mind
Yeah.
over matter, I don't know, but
Well, it might be, strengthening their pelvic floor in a way, and that it just kind of helps in that sense where it's kind of a natural strengthening to because that's one of the things as well. I mean, it kind of comes back to our ability to control our core, and a lot of times when we're sitting, we're not actively thinking about what's actually happening at our core. But when you make a switch like a Swiss ball, now you do have to be at least a little some semi aware of what's going on with your core, or you're going to roll off the edge of it, or
right,
lose your stability and balance on it. So
right. Anything else that you can think of?
yeah, I mean, the other thing you could do if you're already working out to some degree, one of the best things you could do is become meticulously like over obsessive about the mechanics of the movement because those reps you're putting in are ingraining that motor patterning into your head. So if you're constantly practicing poor quality reps, then you're gonna that's what's gonna come out on the other end, right? When it comes down to actually requiring or needing that stability or how your body carries itself. So you need to understand movement. It's your responsibility. It's your body. You have to understand how it's supposed to move to some degree. It doesn't have to be to the fullest of degrees, but have a good understanding of like, hey, a squat, my knees probably shouldn't be dropping in toward one another when I'm lifting a load, and or my back shouldn't be collapsing and rounding because of that load. I should be able to maintain again that core stability and the structure and stability of my legs in that way. Or with a lunge, if there's no stability there, well, find if you're lacking stability in certain areas, find the most relevant or similar exercise that you can that's maybe it's not exactly the same but you can execute it with good quality and just practice that until you can now increase that difficulty again. So the more you can ingrain high quality motor patterning and movement patterning and those in your body, that's naturally again going to feed better mobility overall. Okay, without ever having to really think about it in the sense of, hey, I'm doing mobility work. I had somebody ask me, hey, what's your morning mobility routine the other day? Because I do this thing on my Instagram, like, hey, ask me a question. So that was this question, like, what's your morning mobility routine? And I was like, I don't really have one. Like this is coming from the guy who's labeled as the muscle and mobility
I was,
maker, right?
I was probably going to ask you that too.
so this is how I explained it. I was like, okay, so in the way that most people think of it, I have no morning mobility routine. I don't wake up and I don't do like windshield wipers or cat cow or anything like that. I walk down to my gym and Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm going to do my strength and conditioning, and I'm going to be very conscious about these concepts that I've already talked to you somewhat about. in that training. So I'm going to be very conscious of how I'm moving. I'm going to be, there's that thing again.
I
I'm
love
going
it.
to be
I
very
love it.
conscious of what's going on at my core. Okay. And how I'm activating that in the very beginning. I don't do a warm up. My warm up is my core activation activity. And that's going to feed into the main movements that I'm going to do during the programming, the actual session itself. And then I'm going to focus on the quality of those movements. And that is my mobility work. Okay. And I've built up the range of motion that I have access to with load, and that's kind of always been a focus, and I continue to focus on that. So it's going to be
Right.
full range of motion. I'm going to build the capacity to load that full range of motion, and I'm going to just continue to work it in that way. And then Tuesday and Thursday I do have maintenance mobility, so I dress my joints on Tuesday using banded distractions, maybe cars, those types of things for 30 minutes. And Thursday, I use a blood flow restricted and self myofascial release session through mobility floss, and and that's it. And then any other mobility work that I decide I need throughout the week, I might pepper it in. Like when the kids go to bed, if I
Mhm.
need to do some lacrosse ball rolling or anything like that where I'm addressing the tissues, I'll throw that in because I have lacrosse balls right by the TV. Or I do have a band that I can hook around our heavy marble coffee table. So if I really do want to address the joint, if something's kind of giving me that sensation of like, hey, I should probably do something, it's right there. It's accessible. But again, I don't have a morning mobility routine in the sense that most people would think, but I do work out every morning and I do keep that in my mind as I'm working out, and I've gotten to a point where that's kind of like my maintenance routine. Now, if you're somebody who's in a deficit and you're experiencing pain regularly or you're trying to get your way out of something like that, well then you might benefit from having something that's very focused initially every morning a little bit more than where I'm at currently in that sense.
Right. Um, what is blood flow restricted?
If you've never heard of mobility floss before, this is one of
No,
my favorite tools. It's also
never have.
called voodoo floss, or you might have seen it called rock tape. It's not kinesio tape. Okay, so a lot of people think of like taping sections off. That's not what we're doing here. I'll grab it. I don't know if you'll use the video or not, but you can just to show here.
Good.
So just a little rubber roll. Okay. This one's the thicker one. All right. You can get it from Rogue Fitness, and there's other brands out there. You can get it off Amazon. But again, you're working through compressive force on the tissue. So you'll wrap a section. Okay. And it's really handy from pretty much the wrist up to the shoulder and the foot and ankle up to the hip. You can really use it quite a bit there. But we're essentially doing blood flow restriction by compressing those tissues for a shortened duration of like 2 to 5 minutes max. Okay.
Okay.
You know, they're using blood flow restriction more regularly in physical therapy settings now, because of the benefits of not having to load those joints or tissues as much to see the growth benefits of them.
Mhm.
So, in a way, I'm doing kind of blood flow restricted training whenever I do that session, but I usually just take it through movement. I'm not actually loading to really any degree, but I'm trying to increase the degree of movement that I have and even just help with the recovery of those tissues after a session. So if I'm sore in like my biceps or my forearm, that blood flow restricted state, when we remove that band, you're also going to get a nice strong reperfusion effect to those tissues where that blood flow comes rushing back in. And that's going to help bring in some nutrients to the area.
Do you do it because of the reperfusion benefits? Is
That's a
that
lot
why
of,
you're doing it, or is that
yep.
part of it?
It's part of it. So I
Oh,
mean, you do get the self myofascial release effect, and if you're using it at like the elbow or the knee, you also get what's called flexion gapping. So it can actually create some space for the joint to articulate a little bit better in that way. So it's multifaceted. To say that you're doing it for just one might just be cutting it short,
right.
but I like it because of just the results that I've seen in people that I've used it with. An example is one lady I just finished up from the UK. Her program, she had a knee issue that she just, no one could kind of get it past this point. She kept experiencing pain. One of the best benefits of this tool is that it's movement specific. So one of her issues was like going down steps. The knee pain was always an issue. So what we actually did was have her use it going down steps, so that in that situation where the pain was always being drawn out, we were drawing blood flow into those tissues where they were specifically being challenged. And at the end of the program, she's able to run again where she wasn't before. She couldn't do a leg extension for, I think she said it was like 3 years since she had done leg extension, and she's able to do it with like, I think she said 30 kilograms on it, something like that. So
That's
it's one of those things that, I just don't understand why it's not used more.
dude, I've never heard of this. Like
Yep, exactly.
literally, I've heard of like spider tape or whatever, but not what you're describing here. I've never done it. I've never even heard of it till now. So
Yep.
that's cool. I'm
It's
glad I
it's
asked. I'm gonna
really
check it
cool.
out.
Yeah. Rogue Fitness, you could get it for like $25. It's like it's
And
dumb
for
cheap
people, it's
mobility.
on Amazon too, right?
So if you're in like, I think if you're in like Germany, UK, Australia, you could probably get Rogue. And I usually recommend Rogue because I know the quality is high.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
You want to make sure, one of the things you always want to make sure, and just read in the reviews if you're going to get some, make sure that nobody's saying that it slipped, because if it's slipping, it's not going to do its job as well. It's meant to grip your skin, and it's meant to grip itself. So you want it to be kind
Right.
of, it's got to have that texture. And I
And what's
know
it called? The type of tape it's called again?
so it's called Mobility Floss, or Voodoo
Mobility.
Floss is another
Voodoo
name you'll get.
floss. All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Cool.
Yep.
I love that. And actually, I have a question for you. So one thing I started doing was I have a pull-up bar at home, and I actually don't really do pull-ups from it because I do that at the gym, and when I work out, I do a lot of different pull variations. But I started using it for hanging, and the way I did it was like I work from home a lot of the time, and so if I'm walking to go get a drink of water, my thing is every time I pass it, or at least as many times as I feel to, but it adds up. I'll hang for about 20 to 30 seconds.
Okay.
And I
Yeah.
started doing that because I heard like hanging is good for your shoulders and spinal decompression. I want your take on it. What do you think? I've found that I had some nagging shoulder pain, nothing crazy, but that's gone. And also just grip strength. I've noticed I can hang for much longer
Yeah.
because I don't do it to failure. I just do literally like 20, 30 seconds. I count out loud and that's it. And I just go on with my day. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and it's funny you mentioned it, because right after like every time I do my forearms, elbows, and shoulder, the last thing I'll finish with whenever I have that area wrapped is going to be a hang. So I'll do double hang, single arm hang. Okay. And you can start kind of playing with that. It's almost kind of a traction to a certain degree. So your goal is to be able to kind of let yourself relax and be able to put that type of pressure on those tissues and really decompress the joint itself. But there is a huge benefit to being able to increase your grip strength for your shoulder health as well. So, by you actually being able to grip stronger, that's called irradiation, that naturally helps you turn on your rotator cuff more.
Cool.
So, by increasing that grip strength, you're increasing stability from your shoulder and the strength of your rotator cuff. So, when you do it, intentionally try and crush that bar. It might shorten your
Hmm.
hang for a little bit, but overall, longer term, that's going to feed into just overall greater benefits from the hang in itself. So intentionally think firm grip when you're doing that, and that'll feed
Right.
into the shoulders even more. And just play with different positions. Like when you do the single arm hang on that fixed bar, you can play with rotating around your shoulder. Okay, because it's one thing to add a traction effect to a joint, but when you add rotation, that can actually really help reset the joint and the position of it. So that's something I would recommend as well when you're doing the hanging.
That's cool. I even play around with towels, which
Yep.
engages the thumb, and that's way harder. And I notice my thumb and the muscle that runs alongside, it's completely different. It almost feels like I'm doing something different.
Yeah.
But that's where I notice a huge jump in grip strength when I can grab a towel because now I'm like using everything, right?
I'll give
Because
you one more.
I can kind of
Because
hinge on a bar and cheat, even if
yeah,
I'm squeezing, I'm not really engaging the thumbs as much. But when it's a towel, it's almost I feel like it's mostly thumbs.
when that comes back to kind of that torsion effect that I mentioned earlier that we were talking about, if you're not using your thumb, you're going to have less torsion because you
Mhm.
can't actually get that grip and break that bar or really pull in the way that you should be able to. So close the grip, first of all, and that's one way to do it. But also, a lot of, like, if we look at fascial lines, that fascial line, you said you could feel it, right? You
Mhm.
trace that fascial line. Well, we want to work that other fascial line as well that connects into kind of that posterior shoulder. So do what I call a pistol grip as well. So take
Oh,
the
that's
thumb
cool.
and index
Yeah.
out of it and then lock in those last three. And these are the ones that would tend to get forgotten about
Oh,
regularly.
I've
So
never done that. I've never
you
done
can
that.
start incorporating those. That'll change your stability quite a bit too,
That's
overall.
interesting. I'm glad I brought that up. Yeah, for grip, like I use those captains of crush. I don't know if you've ever heard of those.
Yeah.
It's like the handshake thing, and
Yep.
I'm working at the 200. Like I it's pretty decent. I used to not be able to do 150. I can almost get the 200, which is they have like crazy ones. Like I think it's like
Right.
500. I'm like, how the hell these guys do that, man? I also do pinch grip or like a plank where my on my fingertips and
Mhm.
even the extensors, I find they work the exact same thing. And then the hanging, whether
Yeah.
towel, whatever. So I'm trying to work all the different components of grip. And that's made a big difference. And I really do think it's why, knock on wood, I've never really had anything major with shoulders. And listen, I come from a catch wrestling, jujitsu, judo background where there's a lot of like kimuras, like, you're
Yep.
putting your shoulders like that and stuff. I've even been put in a really bad, like, it's like this, they're rotating and they've taken it till my thumbs like across my back. And dude, the next day I had a little soreness. I was back at the gym, no problem. They're like, I don't know how your shoulder didn't like snap. And
Rip
I
off.
think I do a lot of shoulder mobility, but I do think it's a lot of it has to do with the grips and the hanging because I don't know. That's my theory. I don't know if there's any science to support that, but
Oh yeah, like I just said, your rotator cuff is naturally getting the benefit of that grip right away.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
that's cool. Any other, sorry about the tangent
oh,
on
no,
hanging.
that's that's a great one right there. So if you have an opportunity to hang more. I mean,
Hang more.
realistically, if you're at the playground with the kids, you'll see me on the pushing them on the swing, but then I'll go in the uprights and just kind of hang from those uprights or
That's cool.
hang from the monkey bars. So if you have opportunity to hang, take advantage of that. That can be a great way to work your shoulders. Put your back against the wall and just play with sliding your arms up and down the wall. Simple things like that. It can really make a difference. If you've never seen the couch stretch, so what you do, and it's been named the couch stretch because basically you could drop your knee in the back corner of your couch and so your shin is flat up against the back of it, kind
I
of
got
almost
you.
in like a lunge position. And
Yes.
then, you're stretching out your quads and hip flexors quite a bit there. Don't just sit there. Contract your glutes as hard as you can. It's going to intensify what's happening on the front side, but you're going to see more change there because you're starting to take back that balance of hip flexors to glutes in that position.
It's
That can be a good one too, just while you're watching TV. I mean, like these are things you could literally do when you're on wind down time and still do other stuff because you still have your hands free technically, and so
Yeah, that's
that's
really cool. So we've covered, a lot of people spend a lot of time throughout the day sitting. So, to counteract that, they can stand a bit or, like you said, just move around a bit, like switch your positions. What about sleep? Most people sleep, 6 to 8 hours, whatever. Do you have
okay.
a recommended sleep position or any, gadgets or anything that people can use inexpensive that you recommend? Because sleep is, you know, 8 hours to be in a position is, I would imagine, is important. It's going to have an effect.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So with sleep, I'll actually so I don't use a pillow, first of all. I also mouth tape at night. So I use mouth tape to just make sure that I'm nasally breathing at that time. I do use a sleep mask at night. So I've got a bit of a sleep routine going that has really been something that it's been working for me. One day I woke up with the worst neck pain that I've ever had, where I couldn't move my neck, and it lasted me like 6 months, realistically. So, I was still using a pillow at that time, and I'm guessing it affected one of my discs cervically and just kind of locked up my range of motion there. Ever since I've switched how I've slept and kind of implemented those things, I've never had that issue again. And honestly, my neck is stronger and healthier. So, again, a lot of people are so used to sleeping with a pillow that
Hmm.
they kind of think that that's going to be a crazy thing. But that pillow, they don't realize. I mean, if you're stuck in this position for 8 hours or, this position for 8 hours, of course you're going to have neck issues, or you're going to start to see postural changes. And just like your body adapted to that position with the pillow, it can readapt to the other way if you start to train it to head back the other direction. So I will literally, I mean, I sleep on my side, I sleep on my back, I sleep on my stomach. It doesn't matter. And I know that for some people, like, they probably hear that and think, well, no, I can only sleep in one position. I think as your mobility improves, so do your options in other things as well, where it
Sense.
won't impact you negatively in that way.
Um,
But even just, the mouth taping, a lot of times that's going to change your jaw structure. It's going to affect how the musculature. So if you're a mouth breather throughout the day, or if you're a mouth breather at night, or whenever it is, that's impacting all this musculature around your neck. So when you start to breathe the way you were designed to breathe through your nasal filter here, um, that can even impact the structure of your jaw, how your teeth are being affected. Um, if you want to get a good read on it, there's a book called Breathe by James Nestor. And
yeah.
then there's another book called The Oxygen Advantage by Patrick, what is it, McLean, something like that. But it's called The Oxygen Advantage. So those are two two really good resources that can kind of explain more of why you might want to do some mouth taping at night, and how that could even impact, again, not just your sleep, because sleep apnea has been kind of shown to be linked to how, if you breathe mouth versus
Mhm.
nasally at night,
Right.
cavities, things like that. But even your athletic performance, I probably do less cardio, but I'm still as cardiovascularly conditioned as I was when I was doing more cardio, but I wasn't doing the mouth taping at that point in time, because you're naturally getting almost like a resistance to your nose when you're breathing in, because it slows down your breath in that way. And a lot of us panic because of that. But
Right.
really, again, that's kind of us being weak in our diaphragm and not being able to control that very well.
Mhm.
And if you can get 8 hours of practice of that every night, or 6 hours of practice of that every night, just think of all those reps your body's doing breathing in a certain way, whether it be the mouth or
Right.
nasally.
It's becoming
And
more efficient for sure.
yes,
There's a lady, and I hate that I can't remember her name. I'd like to mention it, but she had cited a study where people were doing cardio but breathing through their nose in and out, instead of even in with your nose and out with your mouth. Is great. It's better than mouth breathing, but just like in out and at that zone 2 level. And
hmm,
if you even get into like zone 3, try to maintain that, which is obviously it's much harder
oh
once
yeah,
you start to get into like zone 3 and up. Of course, you it's not going to happen at the higher zones, but I started to do that, and I always warm up before my workouts at 5 to 10 minutes on, like, I do Jacob's ladder or stairmaster, whatever, just different skipping. I switch it up, and I started doing that, and do like I grapple, I do MMA sparring, whatever, and I've noticed that my heart rate stays lower and I recover quicker just from that one change.
yep,
And it's hard, like especially Stairmaster. That's the one that anything that incorporates more leg. I'm like, I want sometimes I'll have to be like quickly just to get back that rhythm, because I feel
yep.
like I can't keep the rhythm, but I'm getting better and better, and it makes a huge difference just breathing through your nose and exhaling through your nose.
Yep. You lose less water as well, so you stay more hydrated naturally from that. Because if you think
That's
of your amount of vapor that you're actually expelling, if you're breathing through your mouth constantly, it's increased compared to what you would be doing nasally. And it prepares that air a lot better, because it's taking a little bit longer of a route through the nasal passage to raise that temperature. And again, just like anything else, it's going to take some time to adapt if you're so used to breathing through your mouth, and it's going to be challenging. Like you said, you're going to have to suck wind just to try and catch up with the rhythm. But one thing that I always used as kind of a gauge, even before I knew about any of this, was if someone could control their breath through an exercise, especially when I was training them in person, that told me right there if they own the movement. So I could tell right away how much control they had over the exercise, over the movement, by their breathing rate and how well they were controlling their breath. And from a mobility standpoint, that's even going to feed into one of your largest muscles in your abdominal cavity and feed that core organization and stability. So when you control your diaphragm well, when your diaphragm is strong, as well as, the intercostals of the ribs and the musculature that should be really controlling a lot of that breath, well, that's going to increase your ability to create intra-abdominal pressure and stabilize better under a lot of load and lift.
Yeah.
So you're even getting benefits all the way down to, and it's something as simple as learning how to breathe the right way. So if we talk about little things that you could even do throughout the day, shut your mouth and breathe through your nose more regularly, and you're going to see huge benefits there.
Don't say that to your wife. You got to frame it. She's like, what'd you say to me? Back to your sleeping thing. I had a question. So you remove the pillow. I have my girl got me this little pillow that goes between your legs, and it
Okay, yeah,
like and it's specifically for that. I love it. Like I use it every night now, and I find it to be very helpful. I was always using like a pillow anyway. The problem
okay.
is one pillow is bigger than the other. It's not. This one is like the exact size, so it's. I find that helpful, but I can't wrap my head around how you sleep without a pillow when you're on your side. I could understand on your stomach or on your back. I sleep on my side. On the heart side, it's a habit like from forever. Like I
Sure.
will start somewhere else and I quickly go to that, and I love it. I don't wake up with pain, but I get that it could be some lingering mobility issues, and as I get more full range of motion, I'll switch. But how do you? Because my head would be hanging. I don't understand.
When I think that's kind of, yeah, that's kind of the initial challenge too. When you make that transition, like you don't like. Also, when I first started transitioning, it was okay. I'm gonna start on my back, and then wherever I end up, I kind of end up in the night, and just kind of go from there. And at first, it kind of was. It felt like my head was hanging like off a cliff, basically, right? But as I did it more and more, again, I think naturally you're building strength in that musculature, and being, you're kind of creating just an environment where it's adapting to that. But also it can do with your shoulder positioning too. So when you sleep on your side, are you sleeping like directly on the shoulder, or is it kind of like almost on the back of the shoulder, the scapula, and the head can still rotate there? And that's kind of maybe more of the position I end up when I am sleeping on the
Okay.
side. And again, you know, the shoulder mobility almost allows me to get into positions where it's not as steep of a drop off for the neck there, and that kind of makes it a little bit more realistic too in that sense. But I've had members, who were interested and actually made that transition, and they also saw the benefits of it. And it's the same thing. It's like in the beginning, you're going to have a couple nights that are hard, and it's like, okay, I'm not sleeping as well. Just accept that fact. But if you can kind of push through to that other side, afterwards, you'll start to notice benefits to what's happening at your neck, your shoulders. Especially, again, I would highly recommend doing the mouth taping. Maybe not both at the same time if they're both new to you, because
Yeah,
you
yeah,
might want
makes sense.
get used to breathing first before you you crank your neck. But those are two things that can work really well together and just provide a better sleep environment overall.
And the mask is just to like kind of black out, or does
Yep.
it do anything
Yeah,
else, or is
trying
it
to
just
trying to make the room as dark as possible, as much as
yeah,
possible in there, to really mm, dark out any of these external light. I mean,
right.
if you think about it, you have lights on like your, maybe it's an alarm clock, maybe it's a light on a fire alarm in the room or something like that. Just even those little ones, it's kind of the light pollution that you
Yeah,
don't realize your body's actually picking up until you do sleep without a mask, and then you realize how much your body's actually picking up when you're sleeping, or when
yeah.
you kind of have that setting in that way.
Yeah,
So
I've always wanted to try it. I haven't. Our room gets pretty dark. It's like I can't even see my hand.
yeah.
It's like type of darkness. But if I, let's say I have a humidifier in the winter, I tend to use it because it gets really dry,
Mhm.
and I'll get congested. So I use it. Helps. That light is so bright because the room is so dark that I'm like, holy shit! It feels like a beam is like flying because it's right
Sure.
beside the bed. So I'm gonna try that out, and I use the tape that I don't know if you know Alex Hermosi uses that.
Yep.
That's I find it to be useless, man. It doesn't do anything for me. I try it. I'm like, maybe it's this one. I've tried so many different ones. It doesn't seem to work for me.
The mouth taping might help that actually with the your ability to breathe through your nose in that way. I thought like because I would like I always thought, well, I can't. There's no way I can breathe through my nose only because I would wake up congested a lot of mornings. Honestly, that's not the case anymore, and part of it was because of how I was breathing. And actually, if I do a lot of talking, I notice that I do naturally get a little more congested now because my body's so used to doing more of the nasal breathing that it's kind of like, oh wait, we're kind of breathing through the mouth a little bit more naturally when
Yeah,
we do a lot more talking. But that might help you. I mean, even when I was sick and had colds, I was able to still mouth tape. And for the most degree, I had COVID. I did have to take it off during that at one point in time because it was extremely hard, respiratory wise to do that. But otherwise, like other colds, I've even mouth taped through those, and naturally your body will clear an air passageway. It's kind of it's insane. Like
that's
I've
interesting.
even felt my body do it while it was happening. Like just because I had the tape on and I'm like, okay, try and hold out on this, breathe through the nose as much as you can. And you're like, keep some tissues around you. That's probably a good tip that we can give people if they are going to transition. Have a lot of tissues around you in the beginning because your
Yeah,
body's going to be learning how to kind of handle all that a little bit different.
I've never done it. I could see the value in it. I got a buddy of mine that does it, swears by it too. I've just never had issues falling asleep, but I want to try that out. It's interesting, and we'll wrap up. I know we're getting close there, but I had an old coach. He was more of a wrestling coach, but we did a lot of different stuff. And one thing he used to say that stuck with me was, if we were like sparring or wrestling, whatever it was, he would always tell us, like, he would yell out, like, if you could see your opponent's mouth guard, as soon as you start to see their mouth guard, it means he's mouth breathing. And depending on the mouth guard, but usually they have these ones where when their mouth is shut, you can't see it. And the
Mhm.
moment you can see it, it's because he's starting to breathe and you can see the mouth guard. And his thing was like his mouth guard's showing, and it meant go all
Oh,
out now. Because now he's say if his breathing is interrupted, his everything is interrupted. His timing, his explosion, and it made a huge difference. And that sticks to me when I think about breathing, like how important it is. Even in grappling, you have to get really comfortable at having your chest compressed, or like, and a lot of people never learn to breathe properly, and I think that's helped me a lot. Like throughout the day, I don't at least consciously, I don't breathe through my mouth, but at night my girl will tell me, like, sometimes I might snore a little, not much, but I will be like like,
oh yeah,
so I'll
and
try it
that
out.
used to be me. Like I would, I could fall asleep easy. Like falling asleep was never an issue, but you got to think of it as like quality again. So the quality
Yes,
of sleep, how deep are we sleeping? Like that was more of what it's impacting overall, and you'll feel that difference as soon as you kind of fall into that rhythm with it overall with the mouth tape with the eye mask on it. So yeah, that's something that I would definitely recommend giving a try.
is there anything else that you can think of that people can do that are getting started, even if they're further along in their journey, without, of course, guidance from somebody like yourself? Any other little, hacks or new habits that they could start incorporating or thinking about? These are all really helpful, by the way. I'm going to start using most of them.
Yeah, I mean, the most accessible stuff is kind of what we talked about already, just kind of peppering it in. You don't need any equipment necessarily to do those things. You know, when you get to a point where you're ready, then I would recommend kind of branching into the concepts of, how to address your joints using banded distractions and using resistance bands can be really helpful. Again, if you can kind of set the joint first in a good position, that's going to impact the soft tissues around it. So once you're ready to take that step, and maybe you're doing some, if you are a little more active, you're starting to work in the gym. Because this is one of the mistakes I made in the beginning. It was like, oh, well, I'll just do some foam rolling, some self myofascial release work. And again, I kind of said it was sloppy. You know, address the joints first, make sure there's that core focus. So if you notice issues around your core, let's build some stability around there. Even if it's core work at home, like little exercises like planks and holding like a dead bug type position and starting to build those exercises up. Side planks, those can be beneficial in that way. So little exercises like that, addressing the joint. Then if addressing the joint doesn't really resolve the issue that you're experiencing, or if you're still looking to improve from there, then put kind of your self myofascial release kind of second to that, or use it as a recovery tool post workout. Okay, so a lot of times, again, people will be foam rolling or self myofascial release, they'll throw it before their workouts. That's not really necessarily a good time to use it realistically. Yes, you can start to influence the tissues a little bit, and you might be able to kind of use that going into it, but you're going to get more bang for your buck if you address the joints first, set those up really well, go through the workout, focus on the quality of movement, and then finish off with some recovery in the form of self myofascial release in that way. And that would kind of be like, if you're taking the steps of now you're doing it in the gym a little bit more and advancing a little bit more, those would be some thoughts that might help a little bit as well in that sense.
If you got 5 more minutes, I'm gonna ask you some rapid fire questions. Okay. So what are the top three? If you have more, that's fine. But top three biggest mistakes that you've seen in your experience that people make as it relates to their, health, longevity, and tied into mobility.
Three biggest mistakes. First one would probably be assuming that your strength training and your cardiovascular training are enough. So just thinking that you've got all the bases covered just because you're doing strength training and and cardiovascular training. When really, again, those are kind of the pieces of mobility. And if we have that mobility mindset, if that's kind of infiltrating those things, fantastic. That can be a good thing. But a lot of people, it's not, and it's a matter of going to the gym and either doing it just for the aesthetic part of it, or just falling into the trap of following what's like mainstream, like bodybuilding, muscle building type setup, and really kind of using that and getting into that trap. So kind of falling into those things. Second mistake that's probably more common that I see is specifically to like talking to an injury, ache, or pain, is getting so focused on the symptom itself,
Mhm.
and not focusing on the system around it. That's where a lot of people end up getting stuck with their pain. They might be able to resolve it through some PT, but even in PT, you see a lot of PTs just addressing the symptom and not really expounding that to, well, what's happening above and below, how is that system functioning. So that'd probably be my second one, in terms of like, if you're addressing an ache or pain or an issue, is don't get caught up in the symptoms there overall. Third one, I would say, kind of coming down to, again, specifically thinking about how people are working out in the gym, is not putting an emphasis on the range of motion per se, and again, kind of sacrificing range of motion for hypertrophy or something
Mhm.
like that.
What would you say is like top three? These are going to give you the best bang for your buck
Top three.
behaviors. Yeah.
Okay. We'll call it peppering. So really just squeezing into your day as much as you can, just kind of having that in the back of your mind, like, okay, am I doing something that's, positively influencing, or how can I influence the situation to set myself up where I can actually be seeing progress at the same time in my mobility in that sense. So that would probably be one of them, and just being creative where it doesn't have to be something that's set aside per se, but finding ways to implement it into your day. Number two, it's okay to ask for help, and not be afraid to reach out and look for resources, and contact them in that way, or find good resources or books that are going to guide you well. Do some research on it and help educate yourself in that way. you know that's going to be invaluable. It might be sloppy again in the beginning, but start small and just progress yourself based off of that. So staying starting to put yourself in those situations where you're seeing more of what you're trying to become and what you're trying to change into. And you don't have to take everything and put it into action, but you'll at least be seeing these things, and they'll be fed into your mind and getting so you could set up your social media account to have more accounts that are based on mobility, or
Right.
that are kind of with that mindset, and you're going to start to get more ideas naturally of how you can pepper it in your day, or how to go about doing it, and just kind of take your best efforts at those, and do what's working best for you in those situations. I mean, you'll find what's working best. Just be open to experimenting a little bit in that way too.
Right.
And then if I were to give one more there, I guess it's kind of along the same lines there. Is just experimenting, not being afraid to use yourself as a bit of a guinea pig in that way. And again, being open minded about different approaches in that sense, and trying to see the bigger picture in that sense.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay. So I think we're at the time, Jack. I first of all I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate your, you coming on this show and also just kind of not holding back. You really gave a lot from your heart and your experience. I really do appreciate that. I'm really grateful for that. So thank you so much. And secondly, hopefully we have a part two. We'll see how it
Yeah.
goes. But secondly, do you have anything you want to plug? Any websites, products, services, whatever you want to do, where people can find you, please go ahead and I'll make sure it's in the notes as well.
Yeah, sure. If anybody wants to reach out to me, one of the best places to reach me is on my Instagram account, and that's Jack Santora Fitness. So I'm always in my DMs there. If you have questions specifically about your mobility, or if you're experiencing ache, pain, or injury that's kind of inhibiting your training, that would probably be the best place to reach out for me. I do have a YouTube as well. So if you search Jack Santora on YouTube, you'll likely find my account there as well. And if you want to head to my website, you can schedule a call with me if you do want to work with me. And basically, it's a consult where we'd spend 40 minutes. I'd take you through a mobility assessment and then kind of lay out for you in full detail what that tailored program would look like and answer any other questions that you have. That website is www.strongholdstrength. And literally, right at the top, you'll see a button that says hire me. That's where you can find my calendar link and schedule one of those calls and get that set up as well. So, those are my
And,
three main things.
and your website, I would imagine, has all your social media, YouTube, everything on it, right?
Yeah, you can make connections there. I do a weekly email that puts out my YouTube content and also kind of just keeps everybody, up to date with other things. So there's that's available through the website as well. I actually do have a 7-day free mobility challenge that's still up there.
Cool.
So that's something you could go through if you wanted to just kind of. I look at it as almost like a good litmus test. It's really, I don't think there's any equipment in it. It's been a while that I've had it up now. So there's mostly equipment free stuff that you can kind of assess joint by joint from head to toe, kind of what's going on, and even some breathing stuff. Since we talked about that, it's in there too.
Cool.
So you can take advantage of that too on the website.
I'll make sure to include that in the notes as well and the captions and everything. So not to worry. So once again, thank you, Jack. I really appreciate you, man. And hopefully we can have a part two.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you again
Awesome.
for having me on.
Thanks so much, man.